Steve, we're starting the final tonight with two juggernaut teams. What's your thought process on these two teams, and how do you relate to the Maple Leafs on from the hockey you've seen from these two? How far away are they from being one of those teams?
Well, I think what we've seen is that there are two teams that have separated themselves from everyone else. The conference finals were not very competitive, and they were not close in any way. There was separation between the teams almost from the minute the series began. Edmonton looked much better than Dallas, and Florida looked much better than Carolina. And so I think we're looking at a time where there are two elite teams right now in the NHL, and then everyone else is, fighting for whatever the scraps that come next are. And I think there's a lot of teams that are, I'll call them uncertain, teams that maybe on paper look good or on the ice don't look so good. But to me, I am very appreciative. I spent a lot of time in Florida in the winter. And so I watched the Florida Panthers probably more than any other team other than the Leafs. And I'm hugely impressed with what they do and how they do it. And I'm incredibly impressed with Edmonton being able to overcome, the goaltending situation there and the at times, defensive play of the back end situation there, and still find ways when you have the two best players in the world on one team, it changes things. But I think it's a whole shaking out process after 1 and 2. It's like who's 3, who's 4, who's 5. That's a subjective thing, especially now when you don't know what the rosters are for next season. But I wrote a column the other day, and the premise was that of the teams that aren't in the finals, who's better than the Maple Leafs? And to be honest, I can't come up with one team that I say is better. There's a lot of teams that are kind of the same and are all in sort of caught in this vortex of we're not sure where we are or where we're going, but we need to get better while doing that. And I think that's where the Leafs are, and that's where Dallas is, and that's where Vegas is, and that's where Colorado is, and you can run through, the entire league, and I think the East is weaker than the West, and so that's changed a bit over the past few years. But the two teams that are back for the second year in a row, wouldn't be surprised if they're back for the third year come next year. Because I don't see either of these teams. Maybe Florida, if they lose Ekblad, that'll hurt them. But I don't know who's losing people, who in Edmonton's going. That's going to change that roster, especially when 1 and 2 are there. And if 1 and 2 are there, then you always have a chance.
Steve, do you buy the Sam Bennett to Toronto hype?
Not really, to be honest. All winter long, and I think I've asked Sam this question at least 4 or 5 times. He wants to stay with the Panthers. He wants to stay in Florida. Now it's the old salary cap. Can we make it work? Does this add up? What are you willing to pay a 50-point guy who is uber invaluable come playoff time? Mm-hmm. And he's unique. He's an interesting guy. Because how many guys have been like that over the years? Not very many. Not very many 50-point players have been that valuable when it mattered. Mm-hmm. And I remember the Leafs lost to Florida 2 years ago. And at the end of the series, a scouting friend of mine said, for one game, if you could have Mitch Marner or Sam Bennett, who would you pick? And we both agreed, and the answer was Sam Bennett. Mm-hmm. But you're not going to pay Sam Bennett more than you pay Mitch Marner. Mitch Marner is going to get you 90 to 100 points. Bennett's going to get you 50. But for that one game you have to win, guess what? He's the guy you're going to want on your roster.
And maybe that's the kind of thing to my next question, but Brad Treliving's postseason presser, he mentioned needing to change the DNA of the team. And it kind of reminded me of they need more killer instinct, which has been said in the past. What does that mean as you watch these two teams who have separated themselves from the league? You need to change the Leafs DNA, which I do think that they're close, as you mentioned. Like who's a lot better than them that isn't these two teams? What is that thing that they need to change in your mind?
Well, I heard this from another hockey friend of mine. Is you have to go into the corner and then go in with purpose. and go in with anger. And it's not just go and get the puck. It's simplest thing. Winning puck battles. It's a nice term, but Jay, you were in there battling. You got to go in and you got to win those fights. And when you win those fights, then you start owning the game. And I think that's when they're talking DNA, they're talking about how the Leafs lost. And I'm still baffled by it, frankly. They are absolutely horrendous in Game 5 at home, which makes no sense to me at all as an observer of this for the last 45 years. How can you not be prepared to play that game or be ready to compete to the level your opponent is competing? So they have that awful, awful game, and then they go to Florida, and then they have like the perfect road game. You could not have drawn it up any better than they did for Game 6. I mean, they just limited the Panthers' chances, and their best players were their best players, and all kinds of good things happened. So now you go to Game 7, and you think, okay, Game 5 sucked. Game 6 was terrific. You're now going home for Game 7. Stuff should at least be, I'm not saying you're being favored to win. You're never going to be favored to win against the champion, but you should be able to compete in that ring. They come out horrendous to start the game. 10 of the worst minutes you can have. And then all of a sudden, it tilted. And for the next 10 minutes, they were playing very well. They were playing the kind of hockey they need to play to succeed. So I'm thinking, you're going into your dressing room at 0-0. The period's over. You should be feeling pretty good about yourselves. You weathered the storm. Reminded me of the old days when teams would go into Chicago and you say, you got to get through the first 10 minutes and then you'll be okay. Well, the Leafs had to get through the first 10 minutes at home, and then they seemed to be okay. And then they came out for the second period, and they were worse than they were for the first. So when Tree Living's talking about changing the DNA, I'd like to know from Coach Craig Berube, what in the hell was going on then in his mind and in his dressing room? And what was he saying? And I don't believe that coaches say things that impact games between periods. I've been around long enough. I don't believe much of that stuff. I think players get themselves ready to play, and they should be the ones responsible for their play. And from the moment the second period started, the Leafs disappeared. And they didn't just disappear, they disappeared really bad. The old line from Saturday night, that's not right, live, SCTV, they blew up real good. And then that's what happened. And that's why they didn't just lose in 7 games to Florida, because there could have been honor in losing in 7 games to Florida. But there's not honor when you're blown away in games 5 and 7 at home, when you have opportunities to put yourself in position to move on to only halfway to a Stanley Cup. It's not like you're moving on to the Cup. You're moving on to another round to win before you can get a chance to win the Cup. And so when he talks about changing DNA, I think he wants more players who, when they go into a corner, when they fight for the puck, and when they're taking care of ice, and when they're not turning it over in bad positions and in bad places, making bad pinches, all of the things you can add up to what the Leafs did wrong. I think Brad Treliving, he gets a lot of grief, but I think he's done a really good job in the year. And I think he really understands what he has and what he needs to do. And I kind of thank him for the honesty that he showed in his year-end presser, because most GMs, blame it on me, or, they throwaway lines. He didn't give any throwaway lines. He basically said, I don't like this team the way it's currently constructed, and we're going to change it.
Yeah, and I sincerely feel like this team is on the right path, and I haven't felt that way for a long period of time. And I'm right there with you. It's just the massive swings in consistency that makes no sense. Where one game you're unbelievable, the next game you no-show. And we talked all season long about home ice, how it was integral, important. And Game 5 and 7, they shit themselves. But I want to get your opinion on the interpretation of what was said around everybody from Berube to Pelly, to obviously Tree Living, regarding the futures of 2 big bona fide stars in this team, Mitch Marner and John Tavares. Do you foresee both back, one back, or none back here?
Well, I don't think Mitch Marner's coming back. And I think that's I think that's frankly both his decision, his team's decision, and the Leafs' decision. And I think the belief was that you could run if you want to call it the core four, whatever you want to say, you could run those guys for so many years, but there came a point where you couldn't anymore. And this is the point where you can't anymore. And so now it's what can you turn Mitch Marner's 11 million or the 13 maybe you were going to pay him into something else? Where does that $13 million go? And how do you make that work for you? In Tavares' case, I think it's a little different. He's an older guy. He wants to play here. I think they can get him on the cheap. I wouldn't give him a dollar more than $4 million. And I just say, John, take it or leave it if that's what you want. And I would hope that he would morph into your third line center.
Mm-hmm.
And you find someone, I'll throw Sam Bennett's name out there because it's convenient. Someone who can move into that second line spot and make your team better. But I think it's to the point where the group, the four guys up front, Morgan Riley included, been here an awfully long time. They've been through a lot of different playoff incarnations and a lot of challenges and problems. And people look at, sort of the 9 years as being all one lump. I don't look at it that way. Year one, as a bunch of rookies, they made the playoffs, and they not only that, they did it and played awfully well against a very good Washington Capitals team. That if it wasn't for Freddie Anderson, I think they would have won the series. So a bunch of kids came out like gangbusters first time in the playoffs. Then they had 2 season series with Boston, who was clearly a better team. And they won 7 games both times against the Bruins. So the early years, they almost overachieved at playoff time. It was when, okay, now you're into year 4. It started badly when it was Montreal and Columbus, and I don't remember the order of which. It was one then the other, when they just, shit the bed, basically. And they've been sort of going back and forth from there on since. And so you can't keep repeating and doing the same things over and over again and expect to succeed. Brendan Shannon always said, well, I didn't win the Stanley Cup till my 10th year, or Yzerman didn't win till this year, or Ovechkin didn't win till that year. Yeah, it's true, but they didn't keep the same group of people together all the time. And the other difference is that all of those teams that Shanahan would reference, they all had playoff success of some kind. They all had years where they went 2 or 3 rounds. They all had years where they kind of pushed the envelope a little bit. They weren't one and done every year. And so when you're one and done way too often, and you're in the best division in hockey, which doesn't help, look at Florida's been to the final how many times, and Tampa before that, and Boston before that, and the Atlantic Division, even Montreal. The road to the Stanley Cup is through the Atlantic Division, except not through one city in the Atlantic Division that cares more about hockey than all the other places in the Atlantic Division.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of Toronto, the cost of living, the taxes we pay in this country, it's a hot topic right now, talking about free agent signings and that being a determining factor, giving an advantage to states like Florida and Texas to get these big guys. Do you buy into that? Do you think that's a problem? Do you think the league will address it? Or is that not really something that you think is important?
Well, I was told by the head of the NHL Players Association that this will not even be discussed in anything to do with a collective bargaining agreement. I think it's one of the great non-issues of all time. The largest free agent signing in the history of professional sport, Shohei Ohtani. Where did he sign? California. Where do they have the highest state taxes? California. The second largest signing in the history of pro sports, Juan Soto. Where did he sign? New York. New York's taxes, pretty similar to Canadian taxes. So, all of this stuff, you look at the Florida Panthers. Why are the Florida Panthers great? Because, first of all, Dale Talon sort of set a base when he was the GM and brought in some terrific players, Barkov and Bobrovsky and Ekblad. And then he lost his job, and Bill Zito has just been gangbusters as general manager. He got Reinhart for next to nothing. He got Bennett for next to nothing. He picked up one of the best defensemen in all of hockey on waivers. On waivers in Gustav Forsling. We're talking about a top 10 NHL defenseman on waivers. So you go through the acquisitions that they've made, gave up nothing for Reinhart, gave up nothing for Bennett. He's on a run. And then this year he left money available. Who'd he get? Seth Jones. Who's been better as a pickup this season than Seth Jones? Everything Bill Zito's done. I don't know Bill very well, but I am so impressed with the job that he's done. And don't tell what's any of that had to do with taxes, except when he signs a guy after the fact. So maybe when he signs Reinhart on the next contract, or when whoever signs the next contract gets a little less money because there's no state taxes. But as for free agents, who are the free agents that have gone to those places because of taxes? I can't tell you. And many. And you look at any of the other sports, the Miami Dolphins aren't very good. The Miami Marlins are terrible. Tampa Bay Rays aren't very good. You can go through all of these supposed, the Texas Rangers won the World Series 2 years ago, but didn't make the playoffs last year and aren't very good right now. You can run through all these states. There's no correlation between low tax states and success in postseason.
I suspect the gripe would be the salary cap, though, right? I think that's the contentious part of the whole thing is the salary cap. When you can get somebody for dirt cheap and put them with the salary cap, it's a lot different, no?
Well, you can, again, if you're smart and you do it properly, so much of salary cap is when do you sign a person? At what point in their career? At what point, do you sign them early? Do you sign them late? Do you wait to the end? One thing that I'll use the Maple Leafs as an example because it's the one I'm most familiar with. They overpaid virtually every player that they signed in a 5-7 year period. They overpaid Matthews. They overpaid Marner. They overpaid Tavares. They overpaid everybody. So that had nothing to do with taxes. That had something to do with crappy management. And not only did they overpay them, they gave them all no movement clauses. So, there's ways of doing I'll take Jim Nill as an example. I don't care what state he's in. I don't care what team he's with. Jim Nill's top 3 general manager in the NHL. He's going to do a good job because he's that. There's no tax breaks playing in Winnipeg. Winnipeg Jets had the best record in the NHL, and you look at Scheifele's underpaid by NHL standards, and Hellebuck's underpaid by NHL standards, and Connor's underpaid by NHL standards because they set a way of doing business. I'll go back to Lou Lamoriello or Harry Sinden or great general managers over the years. When Lamoriello had the Devils, Martin Brodeur made X. Nobody on the team was making $1 more than him. That was the rule. Detroit Red Wings had Nick Lidstrom. Nobody on the team was making $1 more than Nick Lidstrom. So going in that whoever you were, you weren't getting what you might have got somewhere else. So a lot of it has to do with internal. And this is before, in some cases, it's before there was even a salary cap. Mm-hmm. It's because teams still operated with budgets. A team budget is no different than a salary cap. If the GM's told I can only spend $42 million, then you can only spend $42 million. Mm-hmm. And so that's how all the teams operated. But Harry Sinden had the Ray Bourque rule. Ray Bourque makes the most. No one makes $1 more. Didn't matter who else came along that was coming. It just worked that way.
Hmm. And talking about these free agents and these signings, to change the DNA of this, you talk about getting in a second line center that could provide depth if you bump John Tavares down, if you can get him at a good AAV. Who do you think that guy is? Is there anyone in free agency that checks that box, or do they have to get creative here and relieve someone from cap pressure or do something more creative?
Well, I think there's a better chance of it being trade than it is free agent signing if Sam Bennett's not available and Sam Bennett's not available to you. Because if Sam Bennett is available, it's probably going to be 15 teams, probably looking at trying to sign him. That doesn't mean you're going to be, even though he's from Holland Marsh, may not. Some guys don't want to go home. Some guys love to play at home. Some guys don't want to play at home. depends who you are and how you feel and what your relationship is to your family and your parents and your friends and where your wife is from. And there's all kinds of issues involved, as you well know, with free agency. Not just where do I want to play. There's a lot of other things involved with that. I think Brad Treliving is going to have to get creative. And I go back to Cliff Fletcher was one of the best traders in NHL history. You know, if you go make a list of the players he traded for, it's an incredible list. Hall of Famer after Hall of Famer after Hall of Famer. But what he used to do is he used to find, I'll use Joey Mullen as an example. He used to find a Joey Mullen who St. Louis couldn't afford to pay on the next contract. And he would then go and make a deal for Joey Mullen, and he'd pay him because Calgary was able to pay more in those circumstances. And so what Treliving has to do is you got to research every single team in the league and every single contract. Where are there contracts that don't work? I mean, Logan Cooley, for example, is asked to be traded out of the Utah. Is it the Utah Mammoths? Still embarrassed to say that. He's one of the greatest mammoths. He's one of the greatest mammoths ever.
I know it.
He's 22 years old, and he had 60-some points, and he's obviously going to be better than that. You know, what's it going to take to get him in a deal? Where does he fit in? Or that? And so you have to go team to team. I think he's going to have to get creative, and you're not going to get an $11 million player to replace your $11 million player. You may get a 7 and a 4. You may get a 6 and a 5. There's different ways of looking at it. And you have to find people who play the kind of game that you want your team to play. And so there's a bunch of factors here. And, you know, I think Brad and his staff and his, you know, he's fortunate. He's got like 5,000 people working for him. So, you know, everybody can focus in. You know, you can put 10 people on each team in the league to do a deep dive into who's there, what's their contract situation, what's their value, how much, you know, are they players that they're happy with? You know, you can find those guys. And you know, look at the Buffalo Sabres of 5 years ago. They had Sam Reinhart, didn't want him. They had Brandon Montour, didn't want him. They had Jack Eichel, didn't want him. Well, they all have Stanley Cup rings now. And, you know, Buffalo hasn't made the playoffs in 150 years? And so, you know, you also can focus on, you know, management that you think isn't as strong or as sharp as you might be. And I think there's something to be said for that too. And so, yeah, it's a challenge. It's a real challenge to try and fix everything. But I think he doesn't have to worry about goaltending, and he doesn't have to worry about his defense. And I think he can just focus in on those 3 or 4 spots he needs to focus in up front. And hopefully he's able to put together something that makes sense, and someone who can come in and play Craig Berube style. You know, and there's a certain challenge to that as well. You know, that's, as the Florida Panthers players will tell you, I think this is why they were 10th in the league, I think standings-wise this year. It's not fun to play their style of hockey every night. You can't do it. You try and do that over 82 games, you know, you'll be in a coffin by about March. And so, you know, you have to, you know, the beauty of Florida is they have enough veteran guys to understand this is who we are, this is how we play, and we'll see you in April. But the Leafs need to find some guys who can bring that in November and December and January to show the other guys. And I'm going to put Austin Matthews on the list of other guys to show the other guys what you need to do to compete. You know, having talent is a wonderful gift. It's a wonderful thing to have. But having talent, if you're not willing to give everything of yourself, you know, there's an old thing from boxing gyms. Wasted talent is the oldest story in boxing. You used to see it on the walls of gyms. And every once in a while, when I watch Matthews in the playoffs, sometimes I think, you know, here's an example of, you know, a guy with an immense talent, but he's not able to be Sam Bennett come playoff time.
Make sure to check out more of our content right here on the Leafs Nation YouTube page. We got long-form interviews, we got clips, we got epic rants by Jay Rosehill. We simply have it all. And don't forget, you can find out much more at theleafsnation.com. Thanks so much for watching.